All right, welcome everyone. So we're going to go ahead and get started with our first lecture in our History of the Middle East class. And I guess the first thing I want to make sure to remind you and how to do this is that as we go through the lectures this semester, they're all going to be these video lectures that I have to show you. You're going to want to take a lot of notes. Anything I talk about as we go through the slides, as I'm lecturing to you, you'll see a lot of slides with keywords on them. Anytime you see those key words, you're going to write those words down. You're going to know, not just write the words down, but anything I say about those words, you're going to write down as well. So that's going to be probably the most important thing I can tell you in the very beginning of the semester is take a lot of notes. Anything I say, write down. Any of those keywords, write them down, maybe circle them, highlight them. If I go a little bit too fast, the nice thing about these videos is you just can pause, right? If I put a slide with a bunch of keywords, I might just say, pause it, write down the words, and then keep listening. That's one way to approach it as well. And then as I go through other slides or I talk about those words again, you can rewrite them and write more information down as I give you more details about them. So I guess we're going to start. We're going to go ahead and begin. And the first slide actually that I want to start is really not that significant, but I'm still want you to understand it. It's just some things about dating systems when you talk about history. So I just want to make sure everybody's clear on this. So when you look at history, these are kind of key words on dates. You should know this. If you don't know this, get it down. Some of you may already know all these little terms. But when we study history, very often, a lot of you have seen these terms before, BC and AD. What is BC and AD? BC is before Christ. AD means Anno Domini, means in the year of our Lord. Sometimes you might see this, BCE and CE. I don't know if any of you have ever seen that before, but BCE is before Common Era and CE is Common Era. They kind of sometimes replace BC and AD. I never use them. I don't like them, but sometimes you might see them somewhere. So usually when you study history, use BC and AD. But again, we're teaching a history of the Middle East course. And when we teach a history of the Middle East course, we study a lot of history from a lot of their civilizations. So this is one probably a lot of you have never seen before, something that's AH. And what is AH? After Hijrah. Now, what does that mean? Well, obviously, in the History of the Middle East course, we're going to cover a lot of events after the rise of Islam. And in the Islamic calendar, their year one starts at AH, after Hijrah. And it's around the 600s AD. So if I say something, I won't say this, but if you read somewhere that something happened around the year 300 AH, that would be about 900 AD. So again, it's not too important. If you got a little confused there, it's not a big deal. I'm mentioning it just so you know that there are other dates and dating systems that are used. We use BC and AD, but there's AH for after Hijrah in the Islamic calendar. In the Jewish calendar, if we're studying something from Judaism, today is around the year 5780, right? So, if you think about the different calendars, we can't jump back and forth. We can't go from, something happened in the year 1500 AD and then talk about something that happened in 1800 AH and then, figure out what day it is in the Jewish calendar. We're not going to do that. I'm just pointing all this because everybody would go crazy. I'm just pointing this out to you. So if you do read a source or if you do read a document and it has these different terms and you see something in a Jewish calendar that says the year 5000 or something, it's like, what is that? Understand that's where that's coming from. So just, again, not super important, but I just kind of give students a heads up on that in the beginning. The only other thing I will be referring to a lot is this in terms of dating, and this you should know, C with a period. Anytime you see something with C in a period, that means circa, which means about or around. In this course, you're not going to need to memorize dates, right? You never need to memorize dates. You never need to know Mehmed II conquered Constantinople in the year 1453. I know that because I've been doing this forever, right? As long as you know approximate dates, you should be fine, and that's what the circa means. All right, so that's just a little bit on keywords on dates. Just kind of be familiar with these things. If you're not, I'm not going to test you or quiz you on any of this, but you just should know it because it'll help you understand everything we're talking about. All right, so this is the Middle East history and how we're breaking it down. And I also want to kind of set up on this slide what we're doing in terms of the big objective of the lecture today. So when you talk about history of the Middle East, the history of the Middle East covers a long period of time. And so we usually break it up into these kind of four major periods. As you can see here, Antiquity, Classical Islamic period, Medieval period, and the Modern era. You should get these down. You don't need to memorize the dates, but you should definitely know these are the four basic time periods of Middle Eastern history. Many of you have taken Western civilization. It's a little different. In Western civilization, you have ancient, Middle Ages, and modern world. In Middle Eastern history, we break it up in these four categories. Now, one thing that's very different in my class, I teach Middle Eastern history, than almost any other course that teaches Middle Eastern history, is unfortunately most Middle Eastern history courses ignore this entire period of the Antiquity period. I don't get it. I don't understand it. I don't think you can even have a remote full understanding of the Middle East today if you don't understand what happened as far back as 3000 BC to 600 AD. So we are actually going to spend some time talking about the Antiquity period. You cannot understand the Middle East today without understanding this time period. And so even though your textbook doesn't do a lot about it, other Middle Eastern history courses don't do a lot about it. I've been teaching this class for a very long time, and I'm telling you, this is a very key part of the history to study. So we will talk about the Antiquity period as we go through our history of the Middle East. And so that's going to be the first few lectures, actually, of the semester. Now, before we get into any of these periods, before we get into the Antiquity period, the Classical Islamic, the Medieval or Modern era, we have to understand, look at this date, 3000 BC. Were there people around the Middle East before 3000 BC? And the answer to that is, of course, there were. But anyone before 3000 BC, we group as pre-civilization, right? And the pre-civilization time period covers an enormous amount of time. It covers everything from over 1,000,000 BC to 3000 BC. We're not going to cover a lot of that at all in this class. The only thing we're going to do, and what I really want you to get out of our first lecture, is the following. So this is kind of, now that I set all this up, I want to kind of give you what is the big objective of the lecture today. And so our first step in this course is to understand how civilization began in the Middle East. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this pre-civilization period, but we do need to understand what happens during just this period of the Neolithic period. These words Paleolithic, Mesolithic, Neolithic, if you haven't seen these terms before, they basically mean old, middle, and new stone. The word lithic means stone, paleo is old, meso is middle, and neo means new. And so these are periods of pre-civilization. And while we're not going to go through this whole time period, I am going to briefly talk about the event of the Neolithic period, which is between about 7,000 roughly and 3000 BC, roughly, circa, where there is an important development that helps civilization begin. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through the Neolithic period, talk about what happens during the Neolithic period that allowed civilization to begin. And then the other thing I want you to get out of our lecture today is, what do we mean by civilization? What are the characteristics of civilization? And then the last thing we're going to get into today is, who are the first civilizations in the Middle East? So that's essentially the big objective of the lecture today, all right? So understand again, the Neolithic period, what happened during the Neolithic period that allowed civilization to begin, and then what are the characteristics of civilization, and where do we first see civilization in the Middle East? That's essentially what we're doing with our first lecture today. So I hope all that's clear. And the first few minutes was just kind of more setup stuff. Now we can kind of really get into the core material for the lecture here. All right, so the Neolithic period. So again, the Neolithic period is between about 7,000 and 4,000, or roughly 3000 BC. And one thing that we need to know about the Neolithic period is just one big one, but very important, Neolithic revolution. So again, when you see a slide like this and you see all these words, you're going to want to get all these words down. And if, I sometimes I'll say, hey, I'm going to move on to another slide, pause, write all the words down. In this case, we're going to stay on the slide as we talk about all this. So what is the Neolithic Revolution? Well, the Neolithic Revolution is when, during pre-civilization, people were what we call nomadic, right? What does that word nomadic mean? Nomadic means people who wander around, people who move. They were nomadic, looking for food, hunters and gatherers. So you definitely want to know that term, right? So again, if you just see a term, it's not enough. You want to make sure you know it. And so they were going around, just looking for food until we get to the Neolithic Revolution. Because during the Neolithic Revolution, these nomadic people begin to notice something. They begin to notice seasons. They begin to notice when it's hot, when it's cold, when it rains, when things bloom, and they see a pattern. So that's one key point of the Neolithic Revolution. There's about 3 or 4 major points you need to know about the Neolithic Revolution. And that's another good note-taking hint. If I say there are 3 or 4 points during the Neolithic Revolution, you should jot them down. 1, 2, 3, 4. So the first thing you need to know is during the Neolithic Revolution, people begin to understand seasons. The second thing they do is begin to learn how to domestication of animals, right? And when I say domestication of animals, I mean big animals like bulls and horses, right? One time a student said mammoth. No, no one had a pet mammoth at the time. But bulls, horses, ox, those kind of large animals. They also developed the wheel. That's kind of the third point of the Neolithic Revolution. They developed the wheel. And when you invent the wheel, right, wheel, round thing, rolls, yay, before this time period, they didn't even understand how to create a wheel. That's pretty amazing. But now they can create a wheel, and they have this, device that rolls. And if I could domesticize an animal and create a wheel, combined, I could build things like a plow. Now, so we have seasons, domestication of animal, wheel. Those are the kind of 3 major points. Plow maybe fourth, but then the big thing is, what does all this allow? Why is this important? And the reason all this is important is it allows for agriculture, the agricultural revolution. So when I say the Neolithic Revolution, it's the same as the agricultural revolution, because what it means is these nomadic people are no longer nomadic. They can become sedentary, right? And what does that word sedentary mean? Sedentary means staying in one place. So that's something that's pretty significant, that now people can stay in one place, and now they can stay in one place, they could start to develop civilization. So that's why the Neolithic period is important. That's why I start with the Neolithic period. You can never have civilization anywhere, let alone the Middle East, without the Neolithic Revolution. And the first place the Neolithic Revolution happens in the entire world is in the Middle East, in what is modern-day Iraq. And so even when I teach my Western civilization course, I talk about the Neolithic period, and I say it happens in North Africa, it happens in other regions of the world like East Asia, but the first place is in modern day Iraq, right? And that's where we're going to see civilization beginning as well. All right, so I hope all that's clear, and we're going to move on. All right, so here's another set of keywords, and these are the keywords for the characteristics of civilization. So what's the difference between pre-civilization and civilization, right? And so we're going to go through this, and there are about 5, 6, I guess, major characteristics of civilization. Again, in your notes, you should jot them down. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 as we go through them. So the first characteristic of civilization that's different than pre-civilization is written language, right? Written language is the first term you have up there. In pre-civilization, people didn't write, right? Even in the Neolithic period, people didn't write. They had spoken language, but not written language. A good example of an early form of writing is cuneiform. And you see on this image here a cuneiform tablet that dates back to Iraq. We'll give it another name and another civilization in a little while, but it's a good example of early writing. So that's number 1, is written language. Number 2, cities. That you have large cities now. Now, when I say large cities, I don't mean Manhattan. I don't mean thousands and thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of people. Sometimes just hundreds, but it's still more than you had in pre-civilization. So that's a characteristic. Third that you see on the list here is metal, the use of metal. The Neolithic period, all the other pre-civilization periods were stone tools. Now you have metal. And in fact, this first metal used is going to be bronze. Sometimes we say the period from about 3000 to 1000 BC is the Bronze Age. So not too important if you remember that, but definitely want to know metal and bronze. So that would be used. So one is written language, two cities, three metal, and I'm giving you some other specific points to jot down as well. Another characteristic is occupational specialization. What does that mean? That's just a fancy schmancy word for jobs, that there are different professions and different jobs. So that would be another characteristic. The next one is political organization. And for political organization, that's like laws and rulers and government. Um, some people put economics in there as well. So that's a characteristic we see of civilization. And then the last one I'd want you to know about is monumental architecture, which is building something big. Really good example of that. I'll show you an image in a second here. It's called the ziggurat, and it's located in a city called Ur in modern day Iraq, right? So those are the characteristics. So again, just to recap briefly, written language, cities, use of metal, that's 3, occupational specialization, 4, political organization, 5, monumental architecture, 6. Those are the kind of the 6 key characteristics of civilization that you're first going to see in the Middle East. And again, a good example of monumental architecture is the ziggurat. And there it is. So there's a pretty good image of the ziggurat, again located in a city called Ur in modern day Iraq. All right, so I hope all that's clear, and these are the type of things that could come up as quiz questions, right? So if I were to ask you on a quiz, I might say, what is an example of writing used during the early part of civilization? Cuneiform, right? Or an example of monumental architecture is seen in the city of Ur is called the ziggurat, and you would need to know ziggurat. So those are the type of things that could come up on your quizzes. All right, let's move on. So write all these words down. So now this is a good example. You're going to write everything down here. If you need to pause, write all these words, Mesopotamia, all these terms and civilizations there. And then I'm actually going to go to a map to explain all this. So there are going to be sometimes I say just write these words down. If you need to pause it for a second, pause it for a second, write the words. And then I'm going to go to another slide with a map to kind of explain all this. Okay? So go ahead, write them all down, pause if you need to, and then these are the key words for Mesopotamia, where civilization in the Middle East begins. All right, here we go. All right, so this is a good map, and this is a map that's going to kind of illustrate where civilization starts and why it starts here. And so all those words you should have listed now, all of them should be written down. You're going to have to refer to them and rewrite them again as I talk about them. So Mesopotamia, it's spelled differently on this map. Here it's spelled Mesopotami. What does the word Mesopotamia mean? The word Mesopotamia is actually 2 words. Meso, which means middle, and Potami or Potamia or Potamos, any one of those, means rivers. So when you say Mesopotamia or Mesopotamos, you're saying the land between the rivers. What rivers? Well, the rivers are the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. So again, you should have those as key words there. Write them down. Why does civilization in the Middle East begin here? And again, as we're looking at this map, this is where we're going to be most of the semester, guys, right? This is modern day Iraq. This is modern day Iran. This is going to be modern day Turkey. We'll spend a lot of time here. Egypt, of course. Modern day Israel. All of these are areas we're going to be exploring all semester. But we start here in what we call the cradle of civilization. And so why does civilization begin near the Tigris and Euphrates? Well, there's some things you need to know about these rivers. So again, I only put those rivers down as key words, but that's not enough. You need in your notes to write down everything I'm about to tell you. Like what? Well, why are the rivers important? Well, think about it. They provide several things. Number 1, water to drink. Number 2, they provide water to fertilize the land. This entire area and map on this green that you see is green is called the Fertile Crescent because it's easy to irrigate the land there. A third thing is fish to eat, right? The water attracts animals, which you can hunt. So you would note that. The rivers help for communication, for transportation. The rivers provide mud for building, right? So all of these things are important. So if all you do in your notes is write, well, there are two rivers, Tigris and Euphrates, and you ignore all those other things I just said, you're not taking good notes. So you really want to get all those points down. I'm not going to do this for every lecture, by the way, emphasize everything you need to write down. I do this in the first few lectures so you know how to do well as the semester is going along. All right, so anyways, so those are the important things. The Tigris and Euphrates help the people live in Mesopotamia. But it's not all good. Those things like, oh, great, these rivers are great. Well, they're good, but there's also bad. And you need to know the bad parts of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers as well. And the bad part is that these rivers flood. All rivers flood. The problem is the Tigris and Euphrates flood in an irrational way. You don't know when they're going to flood. You don't know how much they're going to flood. And so you may get seasons where they don't overflow their banks and you have a drought. You may have other moments where they overflow too much and destroy everything. So that could happen as well. So that's a problem. Another issue with the geography in the area is there aren't many mountains around the region. There are these Zagros mountains, but it's relatively open, and so it's fertile land, open, which means you're going to have a lot of people trying to invade you. So the reality is, yes, civilization in the Middle East starts here in Mesopotamia, and here again is this little city of Ur that I mentioned where the ziggurat was. But even though civilization begins in Mesopotamia, it doesn't mean it's smooth. It doesn't mean it's easy. It's actually very difficult. And it's because in part of the geography. You have the rivers, which are irrational. You have invasions very often. And so it's hard to have a long, stable civilization there. So that's something to know. Even when you look at their gods in Mesopotamia, obviously in this class, we're going to spend a lot of time on Judaism. We'll spend a lot of time on Islam, not so much Christianity. I spent a lot of time on that in my Western civilization class, but we'll spend a lot of time on Judaism and Islam in this class, and they're monotheistic. But in early civilizations, a lot of these were polytheistic. And when you look at the gods in Mesopotamia, they were often very malevolent gods, meaning harsh, punishing gods. Why harsh and punishing? Because they're living in a harsh, punishing environment. Even when you look at the literature that comes out of Mesopotamia, some of the earliest civilizations there's an epic called the Epic of Gilgamesh. And if you ever listen to the words out of the Epic of Gilgamesh, you hear these passages of destruction. Let me give you one example of this. So I just want you to listen to these words from the Epic of Gilgamesh to get a sense of how, even in their stories, you see like the ferocity of Mother Nature living in Mesopotamia, because it's a story written in the early Mesopotamian civilizations here. This is from the Epic of Gilgamesh. The rampant flood which no man can oppose, which shakes the heavens and causes the earth to tremble, in an appalling blanket folds mother and child, beats down the crane brakes full luxury and greenery, and drowns the harvest in its time of ripeness. Rising waters, grievous to the eyes of man, all-powerful flood which forces the embankments and mows down mighty trees, frenzied storms tearing all things in mass confusion with their hurling speed. So that's right out of the Epic of Gilgamesh. So, those words are describing destruction from the floods. And that's something that people in Mesopotamia, these earliest civilizations, had to deal with. All right, so there you go. That's the Epic of Gilgamesh. And we're back to our map. And as we look at our map now, we could actually now start talking about the earliest civilizations in Mesopotamia. And these early civilizations, we're not going to spend a lot of time on. We're in fact going to go through them very, very quickly. There isn't too many things you're going to need to know about them, but I do want you to know them. You have those terms there, and you want to be familiar with those terms as these that I gave you earlier as we talk about the first civilizations. And the first ones that you saw on that previous slide are the Sumerians. And I gave you their dates as well. You don't need to memorize the exact dates, just circa. But around 3000 BC, the Sumerians begin in Mesopotamia. And the Sumerians are in more southern part of Mesopotamia. They're not united. They are broken up into all these little cities, Ur, Uruk, Eridu. They use the cuneiform language, that tablet, so they are the civilization that first used that form of writing, cuneiform. So you want to know that about them, of course. And they were around for several hundred years, but never really bonded strong together. They will be replaced by the Akkadians. And how do we know a new group of people come in? Well, they come in with a Semitic language, a different language called a Semitic language. And of course, when you think of Semitic languages, Hebrew is a Semitic language, Arabic is a Semitic language. I actually speak Hebrew fluently, so later on when we get into the Hebrews and the Jewish culture, I'll be able to give you some extra insight into some of that. But definitely, it's just a new civilization that comes in with a new language. You don't need to know rulers and kings of the Akkadians, but they will displace the Sumerians from power for a short period of time until we get to about 2100 BC. Around 2100 BC, we get the second Sumerian period. Now, during the second Sumerian period, it is actually a pretty good civilization. They have quite a few successes in a short time period. In about 100 years, the second Sumerian period accomplishes several things. So I'm going to give you about 4 things here. Again, if I say there are 4 things about the second Sumerian period, make sure you write them down. 1, 2, 3, 4 that you should know. Number 1, it is during the second Sumerian period that they write the Epic of Gilgamesh. So that Epic of Gilgamesh that I recited from, they wrote it down during the second Sumerian period. It's actually considered the first literature ever written. Not the first writing, the first literature. Second thing they accomplish is building the ziggurat. That ziggurat in the city of Ur is built during the second Sumerian period. Third development is mathematics. They developed the concept of 360 degrees in the circle, or if they didn't develop it, they understood it. I don't know if they were the first to develop it, but they understood the concept of 360 degrees in a circle. They had medicine. They performed surgeries, cataract surgery. So that would be 4. I guess there's 5. I said 4. There are 5 because I'm going to give you one more. Astronomy. Venus. They discover other planets like Venus. So these are all pretty big accomplishments, right? So they write the Epic of Gilgamesh. They build a ziggurat. They go ahead and they do mathematics. They do medicine. They do astronomy. All of that during this 100-year period. So obviously these Sumerians, at least the second Sumerian period, very advanced. So if they were that advanced and that strong and they were able to do that well, why didn't they last longer? What happened to this group of people of the second Sumerian period in Mesopotamia? Well, what happened to them is going to be part of our next lecture. All right, so we're not quite done in this lecture. So what I want to do now that we've kind of gone through some material, remember I told you what was the big objective. I want you to understand the Neolithic Revolution, right? How did civilization begin through the Neolithic Revolution? You were supposed to understand what are the characteristics of civilization. You were supposed to understand where civilization began. Obviously, the geography we talked about in Mesopotamia. And then who are the earliest people in Mesopotamia? So far, the Sumerians, the Akkadians, and then that second Sumerian period, taking us to about the year 2000 BC. We'll move on in our next lecture what happens. But I want to also explain, how do you review now? How do you prep? So your quizzes are going to be mainly fill-in-the-blank questions. And so, as I put here, for your first quiz, you'll need to answer many fill-in questions, right? And I'm not going to do this for every lecture, it says here, but I did want you to get an idea of how to help you study. So I'm just reading what you see here. And what I recommend is that if you take notes on each lecture, you come up with as many questions as you can, and it'll help you prepare you for the quiz. So now that I just kind of read that to you, here are some examples, right? The land of Mesopotamia is surrounded by the blank and blank rivers. You should know that's the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The first form of writing out of Mesopotamia is called cuneiform writing. So what I want you to be able to do as you listen to every one of these lectures is write these type of questions out for yourself. So this is a really good way to review, is just write out questions, write out questions, write out questions. I always have students do this, and then we go over them at some point in some way, shape, or form. And one time I tell students, come up with 10 questions, whatever. One time a student came up with like 200 questions. And, how do you think they did on their quizzes? Well, they scored perfect on every quiz because they just kept coming up with more and more questions. And you go, how do you come up with that many? Well, the first form of writing out of Mesopotamia is called cuneiform writing. You can write that question another way. Cuneiform writing was used by which civilization? the Sumerians. And hammering in that way will help you learn it. So that's for the quizzes. That's a good thing to do to practice for the quizzes. All right, so I hope that's clear, something to work on as you're studying and you're reviewing. And then you have your midterm. Now, your midterm is completely different, and your final. Those are essays and IDs and essays. And I don't have enough information yet to show you how to do an essay. As we cover more information and more topics, we'll definitely talk about how to prepare for essays. And I'll give you sheets of paper explaining how to prepare well for essays. But what I do want you to begin to think of is what's an ID, how to prepare an ID. So on your exam, when you have your exam, I'll give you a review sheet, and your review sheet will have 50 terms, 50 IDs. And each one of these IDs, you'll need to know who, what, when, where, and why, right? Who, what, when, where, and why. And you'll do this in a form of a paragraph. And so when I say who, who's involved, what are the details, when, again, you don't need to memorize dates. C with a period is fine. Where does it happen? Where does it take place? And why is it important? So what I want you to do is right now, try to do an ID on Neolithic Revolution. If you were to write an ID on Neolithic Revolution, what would you write? Now again, this is not for your quiz. This is more for what's going to be your midterm way down the line, but I want you to already start thinking, how do I study? How do I take notes? How well should I know these things? So when the midterm comes, it's not like, oh my God, a shock. And again, you're going to get a review sheet with all the possible IDs and all the possible essays. You don't know what IDs I'm going to ask. You don't know what essays I'm going to ask. But if you're prepared well, it's really easy. So what do you think? So what you should do now is pause this video, on a sheet of paper, write out an ID for Neolithic Revolution, telling me who, what, when, where, and why. And then after you've done, unpause the video, and then you'll see what you're supposed to do, right? So I'm going to show you exactly how it should sound, but I want you to try to do it on your own. So pause the video. When you're done, unpause, and we'll move on. All right, so this is what your ID should look like. Something like this. And you could word it several ways. The Neolithic Revolution took place between 7000 and 3000 BC. It took place in many areas of the world. The first place was in modern-day Iraq in the region that is known as Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. During this time period, nomadic wandering Homo sapiens began to recognize seasons. They invented the wheel, domesticated large animals like bulls and horses. They also built plows. This allowed them to grow their own food, which is the agricultural revolution. The reason this is important is it allowed the nomadic people to become sedentary, settling in one place, and that allowed civilization to begin. So what you see with this ID, when you're studying, an ID is not just a definition. If all you do is tell me the Neolithic Revolution is a time where people started to grow food, well, you get a tiny bit of credit, but if you want to get the full credit on each ID, this is what really we're looking for. And so I'm giving you this early in the semester because I want you to be thinking as you look at things I talk about in your review, and when you do get the review sheet down the line on the IDs, when you see these IDs, you'll need to make sure they're thorough. And a lot of it's going to come from the lecture notes. Some of it's going to be from the textbook. Some of the IDs, I mean, that lecture and all are only in the textbook. And so you want to keep that in mind. And so you don't need to do outside research. You don't need to go anywhere else when you get the review sheet. All you need is the lecture notes, anything I specifically assign. If I give you something from a website to read, yes, of course, but in the textbook material. So I hope all that is clear. I hope all that makes sense. And so that's kind of our first lecture. If any of this is unclear, do not hesitate to contact me, especially early in the semester. I want to make sure it's clear. I want to make sure you're understanding what you need to do. I want to make sure all the notes are clear. Some of these lecture videos are going to be shorter. Some are longer. One thing, if they're really long, you don't have time to watch the first 15 minutes. Pause, watch the rest. Some of it might need to pause and go back and listen to again. That's okay. And so, make sure if you have any questions, please let me know. Other than that, I think that should hopefully all be pretty clear. And that's it. Thank you. And we'll move on with more topics next lectures. All right. Have a good day, everyone.